Well, welcome back to our series of videos here at Trauma Lens Care. These TLC videos, this is number 4 of 6. It's titled ACEs. And what we want to share today is a little bit about what we know about ACEs and how it changes the way we look at kids and their behaviors. But Stacy and I, we just want to reiterate for those of you that are watching that we were foster family for a long time, and we have 5 adopted children. A couple international adopted, and we live with kids with trauma all day long. And so we don't consider ourselves experts, but we do consider ourselves to have a lot of experience dealing with this. And so it's a real personal thing for us. We really try to help other people understand what the behaviors are going to look like, and how the challenging behaviors and the really hard things that kids bring with them, that there's a reason for those, and that when we understand where those behaviors come from, it can really make a huge difference in the success of those relationships.
Absolutely. And, if you're working in the mental health field in any way, or you're working with kids, you've probably heard the term ACEs before, which again stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And we're going to go into that today, and we're actually going to have you take the ACEs quiz so you know your score. But what I saw missing just in my professional career is what you do with that. What do we do with ACEs? I have this score, and what does that mean? What does that mean for me as a parent? What does that mean for me as a foster parent, as a professional, working with inmates, working with all the people that I work with in my day-to-day life? And so I will tell you that I'm going to tell a story about when I really recognized and understood what ACEs does and how it affects us in our choices as adults. And one of the cool things in my job is that I get to go into the jail, and I get to teach inmates. So I started this program where we were going into the jail, and I was teaching pregnant women about their pregnancies and about care after the birth of their baby. And I went into this almost in a very self-righteous way. I had been a foster parent for over 12 years. I have walked the floor, and so has my husband, with many a substance-exposed newborn, dealt with many kids whose parents were incarcerated or unable to, what I thought was, get it together to get their kids back. And I could never truly wrap my head around the choices that were made in regards to kids. And so I went into the jail, and I had this mindset of, I'm going to show these moms. And the very first day, I was taught a very, very valuable lesson. I sat across from one of the moms, and just paint a picture in your mind, a woman in an orange jumpsuit, pregnant belly, tattoos, and just looks older than her young years. And it's just a really bleak picture. And she was to be sentenced for 12 more years. So she would have her baby in jail, and then she would spend the next 12 years of his life incarcerated. And so I was sitting and I was speaking with her, and she looked at me and she said, "Stacy, I am not what you see on paper. If you read my file, you would think that I was a piece of crap. You would look at me and you would say, what kind of person is this? Look at this woman who has lost 3 other children to foster care and have been adopted out, and she doesn't deserve to be a mother. Look what she's done." And this woman started weeping, and she showed me a tattoo on her arm, and she said, it was a date, and she said, "That's the day I killed my mom." And I'm like, whoa, what? And so then she starts to tell me just this horrific story of trying to gain a relationship with her mother, who was a victim of generational drug abuse. So her mother was raised by a mother who was raised by a mother who had generationally been using drugs. And she said, in order to connect with my mother and understand her, I started using. And she said, and I'm the one that took my mother the drugs she overdosed on. And that's the day she died. And it was just devastating to me. And I sat there and I recognized that this woman, who was pregnant with her 4th baby, who would be spending his first 12 years of life locked away, did she really have a choice? she started drugs as a child. And so I started doing the ACEs quiz with inmates. And I have sat with hundreds of male and hundreds of female inmates. And what has blown my mind is that the average ACE score for inmates is 7. A 7. And we're going to get into that because when you look at someone's average ACE score or ACE score being a 7, we understand that they have been affected tremendously by their childhood. And their choice to use drugs is an external method to medicate incredible internal pain. And so what I want to do today and what we want to do is really talk about ACEs and then really talk about what this means to you as a parent, but especially as a foster parent.
So one of the things we want to start off with today is to fill in the history of where the ACEs experiment started and how we got to where we are today with what we know about ACEs and how it affects kids. And so in the 1980s, there were a couple doctors in California that had an obesity clinic, and they were working with women who were morbidly obese, who were looking for help to that problem. And so the doctors, when they were working with the ladies, felt like they had really figured out some really crucial ways to help them deal with their weight. And so in one of the instances, a lady had lost I think it was 150 pounds. She had gone from a really excessive weight down to her optimal weight at like 130 pounds. And she had been maintaining that for a few weeks. And so then all of a sudden there was a spike in her weight and she started to gain weight really rapidly. So she had lost all that weight and been maintaining that. And then something happened and it caused her to start to gain weight, and she gained weight really, really quickly. Over the next few weeks. And so as she was in the clinic on a real regular basis and they saw her weight start to really trend upwards, the doctor's interest was really piqued, and he wanted to find out what had happened and why this was going on. And so he interviewed her again, and this of course had been an ongoing process, so he knew her well. And when he started to get her to open up about what had happened, she explained that at some point at work, she had been propositioned by an older man for sex. And so that triggered her, and she started to gain weight. She was eating out of control. She gained weight at an absolutely incredible rate. And so she had not told the doctor about this in her history. She had left this out. So he had no idea that she had this in her background when she said, the reason why that was so profound for me was because when I was a child, from adolescence into my teenage years, I had been abused sexually by a family member, an older man in her family. And so when this older guy at work propositioned her for sex, it took her back to that time when that had happened to her, and it triggered a response. And so then she went back to eating, which is something kind of all of us can relate to. Stress eating. When we get stressed, we like to eat to makes ourselves feel better. It helps with the cortisol stress response. And so she started to gain weight, and she basically, as this process went on and she explained her history, the doctors recognized that potentially the weight gain was a reaction and a defense mechanism to the trauma that she had experienced. And so they started getting this idea that maybe the history of these women in this obesity clinic might have played a role in the fact that they have gained so much weight. And so then they went back and they re-interviewed all of the women in the study and found out that about 65% of them had been sexually abused at some point in their life. And when they correlated that, it really started to open their eyes to the possibility that challenging and adverse things that happen to us as kids can really change our behavior as adults. And so that's where the ACEs study was born from. And
so at that point, the CDC picked this up with Dr. Felitti from the obesity clinic, and they went to over 17,000 individuals who were working for Kaiser Permanente, and they gave them the infamous 10-question ACEs quiz. And so for me as a nurse, the best way I describe the ACEs quiz is it is a cholesterol level for childhood trauma. And so these 17,000 individuals that work for Kaiser Permanente, they were middle class to upper class, all different ethnicities, all different groups of people, men, women. And what they found what we feel is groundbreaking. The higher your ACE score is, the more not only mental health problems that they found, but also physical health problems were found in the individuals. And we're talking problems from pulmonary disease to cardiovascular disease, more broken bones, broken marriages, and things like that. And so what we want to do right now is we want to go ahead and we're going to put the ACEs quiz up on the screen, and we want you guys to take the ACEs quiz. So what you're going to do is all these questions are before you turn 18. So you're going to answer these and think of before you turned 18, whether it was a yes or a no to the question. If you answer yes, that counts as 1. So for every yes answer, you're going to give yourself a score of 1. And then at the end of that, we'll talk about what your score means.
So here's the ACEs quiz. You can pause the video and you can go through and answer all these questions.
So at this point, you should have gone through the 10 questions. I do want to reiterate that these are not the only adverse childhood experiences someone can have. They had to narrow it down to 10. And so for every yes answer, you give yourself a 1, and then you add those up. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you some statistics to show you what each of those scores or your score means or correlates to as far as your health or childhood trauma. For example, people with an ACE score of 4 are twice as likely to be smokers and 7 times more likely to be alcoholic. Having an ACE score of 4 increases the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis by nearly 400%. Having an ACE score of 4 increases your attempted suicide rate by 1,200%. People with high ACE scores are more likely to be violent, to have more marriages, more broken bones, more drug prescriptions, more depression, and more autoimmune diseases. People with an ACE score of 6 or higher are at risk of their lifespan being shortened by 20 years. The first time I took the ACEs quiz, it felt a little hopeless to me. I have a pretty high ACE score. I grew up with an alcoholic father, and a lot of things happened to me in my childhood that were tough. I had an incredible mother, so I do have resiliency in my home, but when I scored myself out, I realized, wow, I have 4. I have an ACE score of 4. And what does that mean? What does that mean for my life? Because I feel like I'm doing pretty decently. But what I recognize is how that affects me as a parent and how that affects me in my relationship with my husband. But also it explains to me and has helped me to be a better parent and to be a better wife, because I recognize that my brain thinks a little bit differently about things.
Yeah, I would add that what really comes out of this is that the ACE score correlates with stress. And so the higher the ACE score goes, generally those people really struggle with stress. And so if you live in constant stress and you have toxic stress, we talked last time about cortisol, that affects the way your brain works and affects the way your body works. And so when they did this ACE study, what they found out was that it correlated, the ACE study correlated with health problems. So they weren't looking for mental health, but now we know that there's an obvious correlation with mental health too. So the stress is the key, the ability to handle and come out of stress, which with the higher your ACE score is, the harder that is for you to manage.
And that's why I have to always be right about everything, so my stress is low. So,
exactly.
So Darren's going to kick off a little bit into to understanding children's behaviors. But I want to talk just real briefly on why an ACE score of 4, I am triggered at times by my kids. It is really important to understand that if you bring into your home a child that has a trauma background, they're going to expose and trigger every crack and crevice in you as a person. And so I have 4 ACEs, and my kids, not through their fault, but they trigger my 4 ACEs. And I have to deal with those 4 ACEs because I cannot regulate or co-regulate my kid when I am not regulated and my stress is low myself. And so I think that's what's really important in understanding how you parent with high ACEs, is that you have to absolutely understand that children coming into your home with hard backgrounds, they are going to expose your ACEs.
And so as a school teacher, one of the things how this really helps me is when I watch students and I watch their behaviors. School is inherently a really stressful environment for kids. There's a ton of social anxiety. From junior high on up, I'm a high school teacher, and I see kids all day long dealing with stress. And so they live in, again, a pretty stressful environment. And so then you see kids, that leads into bad behaviors. You see altercations, you see fighting, you see kids that are picking on and bullying and all those things. And a lot of times those can be traced back to the fact that kids don't feel well about themselves and they're not handling stress, and so they get triggered into that. And so I think it's a really profound thing. You can read up and study a lot on ACEs. There are a lot of really good resources to try to wrap your head around what the ACEs study really tells us about behaviors. But what we try to teach is that when you were working with kids who have high ACEs and have had rough backgrounds, they're going to exhibit those in bad behaviors. And so because they are used to living out that way and being in bad behaviors and maybe living in a really chronically stressful environment, if you bring them into a foster home and you give them a real controlled environment and a lot of regulation, they really might struggle in that because that's not what their normal is. And same in school. When you put them in a desk and you tell them they have to behave and follow rules, a lot of kids really can't handle that. And so you can look at students, or you can look at your foster kids, and you can see through the behavior that they have high ACEs, that they had a lot of things happen to them that are causing them to act the way they do. And when you start to understand that, it really can drive a lot of empathy in you, that I need to see the kid through their pain and through where they are, not as so much as what's wrong with you. We say this sometimes, that's not the right question. The question should be what happened to you. And so they are just a product of their environment. And when they had really tough things happen to them, it's going to cause them to live out and do really tough things, which makes it hard to parent. But there is hope. We want to talk about resiliency and about how in our home, what we saw with foster children that came in with really high ACEs, and yet over time in the right environment with the right relationships, we saw a lot of progress with those kids.
Absolutely. And I think I just end on understanding that when you're looking at having high ACEs in your parenting, it begins with you. It starts with you. And so I recognize one of the biggest triggers for me is when my kids lie. And I will tell you that pretty much every foster kid that came through our home had problems with lying. and understanding that I have to ignore the lie, because the lie is my trigger and my issue, right? The lie isn't about a child out to get me. The lie is not anything that I need to worry about. It's looking past that behavior and seeing, what is this kid shouting out that they need? Because why are they lying to me? And so that's what understanding your ACEs is going to do for you. I'm triggered by that. So either I am going to pass it off to my husband to deal in that moment with it, or I'm going to get myself regulated and see past that lie so that I'm not reacting to my kid's lie instead of just reacting to my child.
Yeah, what we talk about is learning how to respond appropriately, not reacting, but respond. And you have to have some understanding about how to regulate yourself if you're going to respond appropriately and not react. We want to talk in our next video about resiliency, about how ACEs do not always affect everybody the same. They're statistics, and statistics are statistics, and there are always people who don't fit in that. And so what we want to talk about is resiliency, and about where resiliency comes from, how it's built in us, and how it's downloaded to us from caregivers, and then how that allows us to overcome trauma and adverse events.
Absolutely. So we look forward to seeing you in the next video.
Thanks.